Hello and welcome to the Origins of Islam. Today we have quite the program ahead of us, so let's jump straight in. What we want to do today is to look at the timeline around the formation of Islam, because only when we understand the social and political background does the whole story make sense. And we have a lot of maps today, so let's start with this one. And we are starting in the year 250 AD. And what we are looking at here is the Aramaic-speaking regions of the Near East. And what's immediately obvious is that we are looking at a large area where Aramaic was the lingua franca. There were other languages, of course. For example, Greek was very prominent around the coastal regions of the Mediterranean, but Aramaic was the language that would have been understood throughout this region, whereas other languages would be spoken locally. But what we also see is that it's not a homogeneous cultural ethnic area. In the East, all official documents were in Aramaic language. In the West, Greek was the official language. But still, as I have just mentioned, the Syro-Aramaic language, the Aramaic traditions and schools of thought form the basis of the entire region. These differences between East and West are of course also due to the fact that in the West we had the Roman Empire and in the East we had the Sassanid Empire. Now, still in 250 AD, here we are looking at the spread of Christianity. And this was early days for Christianity, but still, as we can see, it's already spreading quite far and wide. Now, the dark patches here, that's where we already have a Christian plurality, meaning that among all the religious groups, Christians were the most numerous ones. In the brighter areas, we have evidence of Christian settlements, but those Christians would have been few and far between. So the Christians of the time were still mainly clustered around those population centers near the Mediterranean and up there in Armenia. And of course, many of those Christians were Aramaic speakers. Large portions of the early Christian literature was written in the bilingual Western Syrian regions, usually first in Greek, but then quickly translated into Aramaic. And also by this time, by 250 AD, Episcopalian structures emerge. That means the church in Syria is organizing and developing hierarchies. What is indicated also by those brighter areas is that we can see the first Arab tribes starting to convert. At first, particularly in the Euphrates Valley, but then later on it also spread further out. And this is the time when the persecutions of Christians in the Roman Empire really get going. Still in the middle of the 3rd century, what is also important to note is that there were constant wars between the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire. And one element of those wars were deportations. And particularly the Persians loved to deport people and to increase their population with deportees. One extreme example was under the Sassanid king Shapur I, who deported hundreds of thousands of people from the Roman Empire into the Sassanid Empire. And we'll jump to the year 325, and that's when the Council of Nicaea took place. And the importance of the council is, of course, that the Trinitarian Christology was adopted in the church throughout the Roman Empire, which means that Arians and anti-Trinitarians were now formally out of communion with the Catholic Church, and they could no longer work from within the church. As a result, many of those anti-Trinitarian Christians who lived within this Aramaic-speaking area that we've just seen moved from the Roman Empire into the Sassanid Empire, which wasn't much of a cultural shift for them. It was one big cultural area, but they could keep their anti-Trinitarian beliefs and practices. Let's do the next jump, this time to the year 410 AD. And now we're looking specifically at Persia. What happened in 410 was that here we have the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon, which was sort of the Persian equivalent to the Council of Nicaea. It marked the unification of the Church of the East, which is also known as the Nestorian Church, and which became the state church of the Sassanid Empire. And what we see on this map are the ecclesiastical provinces of the Church of the East. So these are the places that had bishops and a proper church structure, a proper church hierarchy. But what it also tells us is where most of the Christians in the Sassanid Empire would have been located at that time. In those purple areas, we would find strong Christian communities. The Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon formally adopted Nicaea, so now the Church of the East also was Trinitarian, which of course the anti-Trinitarians in those regions didn't like very much. And let's do another jump. Now we are in 540 AD. And once again, this was a time where we've had mass deportations. Hundreds of thousands were deported, this time from the Byzantine Empire into the Sassanid Empire under Khosrow I. And Khosrow I was the king of the Persians, who in the Quran is referred to as Pharaoh. So the writers of the Quran, they made that connection between this Persian king who deported all those people with the pharaohs in ancient Egypt who had deported the Jews. Khosrow invaded Syria, he sacked Antioch, and he extorted large sums of money from a number of other cities, and almost all of Antioch was deported to the east. Okay, now we are in the year 600, and this is right at the brink of the important events that kick everything off. And once again, we want to look at the spread of Christianity, and we can see how the situation has changed from the first time we looked at this map in 250. So in the last couple of centuries, Christianity became the dominant religion in the Byzantine Empire. So those are the dark areas, but you can already see how those dark areas move into the Sassanid Empire. The western parts, so Iraq and even parts of Iran, are now majority Christian. But even those brighter areas, whereas before in 250 there were really only very few Christians present, now we have a strong minority in many of those places. Particularly in Persia, we can see very strong Christian communities, which are not the majority yet, but which are growing and are prospering. Now let's look at the year 602. And this is when the last war between the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire started. And what has happened is that the Byzantine Empire really was at a low point. The finances were depleted, the army mutinied several times due to a lack of pay. And finally, they proclaimed their general Phocas as emperor, who marched onto Constantinople, eventually killing his predecessor Maurice. When Maurice was killed, Narses, the governor of the Byzantine province of Mesopotamia and a close friend of Maurice, rebelled against Phocas and seized Edessa. Phocas, of course, sent his army to Edessa, but Narses then called Khosrow II for help. Khosrow II, by that time, was the king of the Sassanid Empire. And it is important to note that the only reason why Khosrow is even king was because of Phocas's predecessor, Maurice, who helped Khosrow II gain the throne during the last war that happened between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. And as part of the resulting peace deal, Khosrow II married a daughter of Emperor Maurice. Khosrow saw his chances with a weakened Byzantine Empire, and under the pretense of fighting for the right of his father-in-law and his family, he now marches into the Byzantine Empire. Now for the Byzantines, this couldn't have come at a worse time. The finances were depleted, they just had a violent uprising, and they were under pressure from barbarians in the west. And now let's have a quick look in the west. This is a simplified map of how Europe looked like at the time. And what we can see here is that the Byzantines are on the defensive across the board. And it is again important to understand that just 50 years before, the Byzantines under Justinian were in the process of restoring the Roman Empire of old. They had reconquered all of Italy from the Ostrogoths. They had reconquered southern Iberia from the Visigoths. And they had reconquered northern Africa from the Vandals. But then one catastrophe followed the next, starting with the Justinian plague, which decimated the Byzantine population, added to by the arrival of the Avars, which are here this brown blob in the center of the map, who put a lot of pressure on the Byzantine Empire, but not just the Byzantines, also the barbarian tribes who lived in those regions at the time. For example, the Longobards, who then move into Italy. At the same time, in the east, in 540, another war breaks out with the Sassanids. That's what we've seen before when Khosrow I deported all of Antioch. So there was a lot of pressure from all sides, but the biggest threat for the Byzantines was always the Persians. So they had to focus all of their attention into the east, which left the door open in the west for the barbarians to gain ground. So the Longobards are moving into Italy and are gaining ground. As you can see on this map, the dark areas there are now all controlled by the Longobards. The Visigoths are now in the process of kicking the Byzantines out of the Iberian Peninsula altogether. And while the war with Persians ends in 562, the next one starts just 10 years later. And that's the war which ends with Khosrow II gaining the throne in 591. And as is to be expected, given the dire situation the Byzantine Empire was in, the war really doesn't go their way. So now let's jump to 621. Now we are 19 years into the war, and so far the Byzantines have lost every single battle, and the Sassanids are on the verge of a complete victory. So let's just recapitulate what has happened in those years. In 608, another civil war breaks out within the Byzantine Empire because Phocas turns out to be a tyrant who really alienates everyone, who rules with an iron fist, but who can't defend the country against the Sassanids. So even though it seems like a pretty terrible idea to start killing one another while you're attacked on two fronts, in the east by the Sassanids, in the west by the Avars, as it turns out, this is what might have saved the Byzantine Empire. By 610, Heraclius defeats Phocas and becomes emperor, and the civil war is over. And he starts a complete reorganization of the Byzantine Empire from the ground up. But of course, these kinds of changes take time, and he didn't have an army that was capable of standing against the Sassanids, so he needed to play for time, and that's what he tried. But of course, Khosrow II, he didn't waste any time, and he marched forward. By 613, Khosrow II had conquered Syria. In 614, he takes Jerusalem, destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and steals the True Cross, which was a major blow for Christianity at the time. And by 615, the Persians reach Chalcedon, which is right across the Bosporus Strait from Constantinople. So they could see Constantinople from where they were. But the Bosporus Strait was between them and the Byzantines, and the Byzantines still had the best navy, so they couldn't get to Constantinople from the east. But still, the situation was so bad that Heraclius actually wants to capitulate. He offers to Khosrow to turn the Byzantine Empire into a client kingdom of the Sassanid Empire. Now, historians aren't sure if he was actually serious, if this was a serious offer, or if he just wanted to play for time, if he wanted to start negotiations that then would go nowhere. In the meantime, he could start regrouping. Either way, Khosrow rejects. Everything is going so well for him that he thinks he can just take the Byzantine Empire outright. And of course, his victories keep on coming. By 618, Heraclius actually plans to abandon Constantinople and with it Asia Minor and the entire Byzantine East. And instead, he wants to move his capital to Carthage, from where he wants to reorganize a newer and smaller empire. But once those plans get leaked, there are massive protests. Obviously, the people of Constantinople don't want to be abandoned, and particularly the church is vehemently against this idea. So in the end, Heraclius stays, but the church agrees to finance his war effort from now on, which immediately took off a lot of the financial burden. And once again, historians aren't sure if this wasn't the plan all along, or if Heraclius actually planned to abandon Constantinople. But of course, the Persians still march on, and in 619, Khosrow II conquers Alexandria, and all of Egypt is under Persian control by 621. And that's what we see here on the map. But then something quite unexpected happened. In 622, Heraclius had a decisive victory against the Sassanids. In fact, it was the very first victory in the 20 years since the war started, but it was a really important one. So what has happened is that over the previous years, Heraclius's reforms, they started to work. He was slowly building a force that could take on the Persians. They still had the larger army, but they were spread out, and Heraclius's army was now a match for the main Persian army which stayed in Asia Minor. Just after Easter in 622, Heraclius marches from Constantinople with his army towards the Persians. But instead of engaging them, he marches straight past them and into Armenia, which would have been the gateway into Persia. The Persian army, once they realized what was going on, they scrambled to rush and get to Heraclius before he could enter into Persia. And indeed, in Armenia, the decisive battle happened and the Persian army was completely annihilated. But the important part now is that the Sassanids had to regroup. So what they did was they recalled their Persian troops from the occupied lands, and they recruited new soldiers, of course, in Persia, and they tried to build a new powerful army in order to take on Heraclius. So the lands in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, they were no longer occupied by the Sassanids, but the Byzantines were also in no position to rush back in. If they had spread out their troops again, they would have been easy pickings for the Sassanid army once they come back in. What Heraclius does instead is he comes to an agreement with the strongest forces that are left now in those lands, and those were the Arabs. Now, Arabs were already present there before all of this started. We had, for example, the Ghassanids, who were a client kingdom of the Byzantine Empire for a long time. But now through the war, even more Arabs came in because a lot of Arabs came as auxiliaries for the Persians. Now, auxiliaries are troops that are not part of the main army, but they fight side by side and are usually comprised of single ethnic groups. And those Arabs, they came with the Persian army, but they stayed when the Persians left. So now we have here a mixture of Arabs who've already been there, like the Ghassanids, and of Arabs who've just recently arrived, and Heraclius made them into clients. Just like the Ghassanids, now there were lots of Arab tribes who became Byzantine clients, which means that they would respect the central authority of the emperor in Constantinople, but all they needed to do is to keep the land safe, to be open for trade with the Byzantine Empire, and to provide troops when called upon. Other than that, they were basically autonomous. So in 622, what we see is new governmental structures emerging, and those would be the Arabs who now control those lands in the Near East. But of course, the war wasn't over. There was now a counteroffensive from the Sassanids, who allied themselves with the Avars, and the two of them attacked Constantinople from two sides at the same time. But in the end, they were repelled. The Byzantine navy was a major factor in it because it prevented the Sassanids from joining the actual fight for Constantinople, so that only the Avars needed to be repelled at the gates. But eventually, with his new army, as well as some smart alliances, Heraclius defeated the Persians and marched onto their capital, Ctesiphon, at which point Khosrow fled, but who quickly was deposed of, killed by his own son, who then quickly sued for peace. Now, Heraclius was only too happy to accept any peace offering, given how close the Byzantine Empire was to total defeat, but also given how drained the resources were at this point. So even though the Byzantines had just utterly defeated the Persians, they didn't demand high reparations or territorial gains, as was usually the case in the past. They settled for the same borders as before, and other than that, the only condition was that the Persians would give back the true cross and reinstate it in Jerusalem. But even though the Byzantines technically were given back all their lands, they still couldn't occupy it. So having Arabs as clients now became a permanent feature. Now to our next jump, this time only a few years, from 628 to 641. And 641 is the year when Emperor Heraclius dies. And what happens immediately after his death is that these Arab clients now start to mint their own coins. And that is a sure sign that they no longer respect the central authority. Minting coins was a royal prerogative, so now those Arabs saw themselves as the legitimate rulers. Apparently, they felt a personal relationship to Heraclius, whom they revered for giving them their own countries, their independence. But once he was gone, that debt was paid and they started to rule without Byzantine interference. And in fact, Heraclius was so revered among the Arabs that there are even fables of the Prophet Muhammad writing letters to him. They wanted to connect the Prophet to the Emperor Heraclius because Heraclius was such a revered person. Now, 10 years later, and what we see is the final collapse of the Sassanid Empire. And the traditional story is that starting with the Rashidun caliphs, the Muslim armies invaded Persia and conquered it by 651. But in reality, when we look at the facts on the ground, there is no evidence for a Muslim conquest. There's no archaeological evidence of large-scale destruction or of abandoned villages, which is something that we definitely would see if a large army was roaming the country, because this army would need to be fed, and the food typically comes from those smaller villages, from the farmers there. So we would see a large path of destruction in the wake of such an army in the archaeological record, which we don't see, in fact. At the same time, we do have some Christian sources which talk about the Arabs. So, for example, in a Syrian chronicle from the year 675, it is mentioned that, quote, the sons of Ishmael were gifted victory by God, end quote. And similarly, John Bar Penkaye writes in 687 that the Arabs won 2 kingdoms, quote, without war or battle, God gave them the victory, end quote. So those sources agree with the archaeological record. There was no major war. There might have been some minor skirmishes here or there, but there was no major war. So what happened instead? Right after the end of the war with the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Empire descends into a civil war. That civil war lasts 4 years until 632. And that's also the time when it is typically believed that the Muslim conquest began. Now, the reality is that the Muslim conquest really was a continuation of the civil war by another name. What do I mean by that? The civil war, as it's traditionally understood, was a war for the throne. We had various contenders for the throne, some more legitimate, some less legitimate, who battled it out. And in those 4 years, I think we had around 10 different kings for the Sassanid Empire. Eventually, in 632, Yazdegerd III is established as the king, and after that, there's no other contender left, which is why this is typically seen as the end of the civil war. But in reality, what we see is that the civil war goes on, it just changes shape. It's now no longer a war for the throne. Now it's fracturing into multiple little wars of independence. Because what we need to keep in mind is that the Sassanid Empire was a multi-ethnic state with strong local feudal lords. And those lords in the civil war, they formed alliances with one another and against one another in order to support their favorite for the throne. But once this battle for the throne was over, those lords who felt like they might have lost out instead decided to go their separate way from the king in Ctesiphon. And once again, we can tell by the coins, because after 632, we see local lords minting their own coins, meaning they now saw themselves as the legitimate rulers of their lands, not the Sassanid king. So what we really see is that over the next 20 years, the civil war wages on, but only with minor skirmishes here and there. It was mainly about alliances. The king needed support, and in general, what seems to be the case is that Yazdegerd III was pretty terrible at forming alliances. In fact, he managed to alienate even his closest friends. So in the end, he lost more and more control of his country. The Persian army was very depleted from the war with the Byzantines. Then came the civil war, which depleted it even more. So when those local lords, when they started forming their own power base, they didn't have much of a reservoir to draw an army from. So what they would do instead is they would hire mercenaries or auxiliaries. And those auxiliaries were Arabs. Over the course of those next 20 years, it would be the Arabs who would become more and more important in the power structure of the fracturing Persian Empire. And at the end, they were the largest military force. What we actually see here is a disintegration of the Persian Empire in a continuation of the civil war, which left the Arabs sort of in power by accident, because they were the last major group that could still field armies. In 651, Yazdegerd III is killed in the city of Merv, up here in the far northeastern corner of the Sassanid Empire. He had to retreat to there because he was really losing ground everywhere. And with the last vestige of the old empire gone and no new legitimate ruler in sight, the Arab warlords basically just assumed power with nobody who could stand in their way. But at this time, we still don't have a caliphate. So that's why I have those stripes here. What it means is that this was still very much a fractured region. We had former Arab clients of the Byzantine Empire in the west. We had Arab warlords in the east, in the former Persian Empire. And of course, we have Arab tribes on the Arabian Peninsula, but no cohesive structure, no central government of any kind. But that changes relatively soon after. By 662, Muawiyah is elected Amir al-Mu'minin. That would be the commander of the faithful. We first have this attested to in southern Iran, but then he takes residence in Damascus. Muawiyah, he would have ruled as first among equals. Apparently he was chosen from among the different local rulers and warlords to form a central government. And as was the norm back in those days for an Arab leader, he could only project legitimacy by protecting an important sanctuary. And as a Christian, Muawiyah chose Damascus, which hosted the most important Christian pilgrimage site of the day, the head of John the Baptist. And here we have a coin which contains a lot of this symbolism. We don't necessarily know that the person on this coin is Muawiyah, could have been one of his successors, but the symbolism would have been the same. So what we can see there is we have the commander of the faithful, who in the one hand holds a spear, which is a symbol for the protection. He's protecting something. The other hand rests on a head in a vessel, and that head is obviously the head of John the Baptist, which is indicated by a dove that is descending on the right of the coin, harkening back to the story in the Bible with the Holy Spirit descending upon Jesus during the baptism. And on the right, next to the spear, we have some Christian symbolism. Again, we have a palm leaf and a cross. Coins like this were, of course, important because coins were the main means of distributing propaganda. There was no social media, no newspapers, TV, radio, nothing. But the one thing that everybody looked at every day was, of course, coins. And this coin in particular is intended to proclaim the legitimacy of Muawiyah's or his successor's rule based upon his protection of this important sanctuary. Under Muawiyah, we also have the oldest reference to the Arabic calendar. There is an inscription at the baths of Hamad Gader. Those baths were restored under his rule, and this restoration is commemorated with this inscription, which is dated according to several different dating systems, one of which is called the date according to the Arabs. And it's the oldest reference that we have today. It does not mention the Hijra, it only mentions the year according to the Arabs. And that year is, of course, 622, when Muhammad supposedly fled from Mecca to Medina. But as we've seen just a few slides before, 622 was an important year for a quite different reason. And that is because in 622, the Arabs gained their independence, which is the actual reason why 622 is the year according to the Arabs. It's their independence from the Byzantines on one side and the Persians on the other side. Under Muawiyah, this newly formed empire, it wasn't yet called a caliphate, that is a later term, but for the sake of simplicity, let's call it a caliphate. This newly minted caliphate became the enemy of the Byzantine Empire. And there are different reasons, of course. For one, when you have a new empire, the old one always becomes the enemy. That's just in the nature of things. The old guard doesn't want to give up. The new guard wants everything the old guard has. There's always a power struggle. In most cases in history, the emergence of a new empire has led to war. But on top of that, Muawiyah also rules in the continuation of the Sassanid kings. So now all of Persia is among his subjects. And for the Persians, the Byzantines are the arch enemy, and they longed for vengeance for their defeat in 628. So there's a lot of pressure coming from the east of his caliphate to finally take Constantinople and defeat the Byzantines once and for all. And indeed, that's what he tries. Muawiyah has learned from the mistakes that were made in the past, particularly by the Sassanids. Their big problem was that they didn't have a navy. And without a navy, taking Constantinople was always almost an impossible task. But Muawiyah now is in control of all the ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. He builds a massive fleet. And indeed, he defeats the Byzantine fleet, which was a major shock for the Byzantines and which was taken as a sign that the fall of Constantinople is imminent. Muawiyah, with his new fleet, he now takes island after island along the coast of the Byzantine Empire to provide a supply line for his attack on Constantinople, which is going to be a naval attack. Eventually, he gets close enough to Constantinople to set up a base from where he would attack the city by sea. But unexpectedly to him and many others, his campaign ended in 674 in a disastrous defeat, which in large part was due to the fact that the Byzantines for the very first time used what's now known as Greek fire, which changed the nature of naval warfare. Simultaneously, Muawiyah's armies also lose a major battle against the Byzantines, so he sues for peace and has to pay yearly tributes to the Byzantine Empire. This defeat seems to have weakened Muawiyah's standing among the other Arab leaders. So around the same time that he lost to the Byzantines, Abdallah ibn al-Zubayr is pronounced commander of the faithful in the east, although he is never able to take control over much more than southern Persia. In 681, we lose track of Muawiyah and he seems to disappear from the historical record. We do not know what exactly has happened to him, but it seems like Abd al-Malik became his successor, which is earlier than in the traditional history. But we do have coins dated to the year 681 with Abd al-Malik's name on them, so we know that he must have taken control by that time. Now, one of the most important monuments built in those days is, of course, the Dome of the Rock, which is completed in 694 under Abd al-Malik. And it is important for several reasons. For one, it's the first monumental structure which is built by the Arabs. It is built in the tradition of Syrian Byzantine churches. The architecture is just like previous churches built in that area. And what is important for us today is the inscription on the inside wall. So that's the original inscription, which was commissioned by Abd al-Malik. It was later restored by al-Mamun, who added the diacritical marks. But initially, this inscription was without any dots, just like the original Quran manuscripts. And not only do we see the oldest references to some verses in the Quran, what we also see here is that clearly Abd al-Malik was an anti-Trinitarian Christian and that the word Muhammad was used to describe Jesus. In this inscription, Jesus is identified as the praised one, and the praised one literally translates to Muhammad. We will go into this inscription in more detail in a later episode, that's why I'll stop it here. But I want you to look at the mosaic real quick. There are grapes everywhere, because as I've mentioned in the video about Christoph Luxemburg, grapes are the prototypical fruits of paradise. And this is what's invoked here. And in fact, it's not just this one picture. You can look at pictures of these inside walls of the Dome of the Rock, and there are grapes everywhere. Now another jump, this time to 750, and this is when the Abbasids take over. Until then, the ruling family was that of the Umayyads. They were all killed, their tombs desecrated, and instead the Abbasids are now the ruling clan. In 756, the so-called tomb of the Prophet is built in Medina, but initially that's not what it was. It was a Christian sanctuary. We don't know exactly what for or why it was built, but what we do know is that this is the last inscription where Jesus is referred to as the Muhammad. So we've seen that in the Dome of the Rock. We also have this on some coins, which I didn't go into here. So we do have coins even earlier than the inscription of the Dome of the Rock, where we have Christian symbolism and then the word Muhammad, clearly referring to Jesus as the praised one. And we also have this on the tomb of the Prophet in Medina for the last time. So every other inscription that we know of that came after 756, if there is Muhammad mentioned, it's referring to the Prophet Muhammad, no longer to Jesus as the praised one. Also important to note is that the 7th and 8th century were a golden age of Syrian Arab Christianity. Never before and never after were so many churches built. Missionaries went all the way to China. The Syrian church spread from Mauritania to China. And now, 825. We're getting closer to the end. 825 is the year when the regent Al-Mamun moved from Merv to Baghdad. In a previous video, I mentioned that Merv was at one point the capital for the entire caliphate. That was under Al-Mamun. But in 825, he moved to Baghdad. Al-Mamun, he can be considered to be the first caliph in the sense that he was the first one to coin this phrase, to call himself caliph. And what is known as the Islamic Golden Age is generally understood to have started with Al-Mamun. This time is also called the Persian Renaissance or the Iranian Intermezzo, because this period in history saw a rise of various native Iranian dynasties. On this map, I've highlighted, for instance, the Tahrid dynasty, which controlled a large portion of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, they still respected the authority of the Caliph, but then later dynasties, they would outright reject the authority of the Caliph and just rule independently in their regions. But this Persian Renaissance didn't just manifest itself in the rise of these dynasties, it also manifested itself in this Golden Age. So really, instead of Islamic Golden Age, it should be called Persian Golden Age, because it was dependent upon those Persian traditions of literature, of medicine, of astronomy, and of science in general. All the big names in this Golden Age were Persians, and they really advanced things. It was the Persian mindset that made this possible. And someone like Al-Mamun, he was taught by Persians. He lived in Merv, which was a major Persian city for many, many years. He took this culture in and he brought it with him to Baghdad, where he opened the House of Wisdom, which can be seen as sort of this origin story for this golden age. Also interesting about this year, so around the year 825, we don't know exactly when, but somewhere around this time, the Chronicle of Sirt is being written, and that is the history of the Nestorian Church. It was written in Arabic, and it documents many deportations of Christians centuries earlier. So this is, for example, one of these sources that we have, which really detail out where people were deported from and sometimes where they went to. And it also tells us specifically that Christianity really came into Iran through these deportations. But apart from that, it also talks about the rise of the Arabs. And from the Christian point of view of these Nestorians, the Arabs were seen as liberators from Zoroastrian oppression. And here's a direct quote from the Chronicle of Sirt. The Arabs treated them with generosity, and by the grace of God, may he be exalted, prosperity reigned, and the hearts of Christians rejoiced at the ascendancy of the Arabs. May God affirm and make it triumphant. Now, that doesn't sound like this Christian author is talking about a foreign religion which is taking over the countries. On the contrary, apparently the Arabs supported the Christians in these lands. And why is that? Well, because as we've seen, they were Christians themselves. So now we come to the end of our timeline, and I want to end with the same map that I started with. If you remember, in 250 AD, Aramaic was spoken throughout the Near East. By 850, it's barely spoken anymore. And the reason is that starting with Abd al-Malik, a strict Arabization policy was implemented. And now Arabic was the lingua franca. Arabic was the language that everybody had to learn in addition to their native language. So Aramaic really was now reduced to those areas where it remained the native language of the people. And this also explains why we have so many misreadings of the Quran. If you remember in the episode we did about Christoph Luxemburg, he identified lots of Aramaic words in the Quran. And while Aramaic was still the lingua franca, people had a chance of identifying them. But now, since the majority does no longer speak Aramaic, but only Arabic, they couldn't correctly understand those texts anymore. So, for example, they didn't understand anymore that Hur'in are grapes in paradise, and they didn't understand anymore that Muhammad means the Blessed One and was a title applied to Jesus. Right, and now here we have some of the important events put together on one slide. So we have the deportations under Shapur I. We have the Council of Nicaea in 325, which drove those anti-Trinitarian Christians into the Persian Empire, where the Quran originates, which is what we've seen in the last episode. In 410, we have the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon, which is then the beginning of the Hellenization of the Church of the East. Hellenization in quotes, but it is the introduction of this Greek approach to Christianity. In 540, we have the deportations under Khosrow I, where all of Antioch is deported to the east. Then, very important, in 622, the Arab independence, and that is the beginning of the Arab calendar. In 681, a bit earlier than traditionally believed, Abd al-Malik becomes regent, and by 694, the Dome of the Rock is completed. And then 825, Regent al-Mamun moves to Baghdad. This is really the point where I would say this pre-Nicene anti-Trinitarian Christian religion tips over into the new religion called Islam. Because it was under Al-Mamun that a lot of these readings of the Quran that we are now familiar with were fixed. He added the diacritical marks on the inscription in the Dome of the Rock. He therefore fixed the reading of Muhammad as the prophet and no longer as the Blessed One, even though this was a process that was already going on. So as we've seen already in the 8th century was the last time that Muhammad was used as a title for Jesus. Something else that I try to highlight here are the periods of war between the Romans, or later the Byzantines on the one side and the Sassanids on the other side, and those are those stripes in the background. So whenever there's this dark stripe, there was a war going on between Romans or Byzantines and the Sassanids. And whenever there was a war, there were typically deportations. Not always as massive as under Shapur I or Khosrow I, but deportations would have been commonplace. So given the sheer amount of wars and deportations, it's easy to see how this opened the door for Christianity to enter into Persia and then grow from within. Okay, in summary, we can say that the Near East was under constant tension between the Byzantines and the Sassanids, and the Arabs were caught in between. By 600, all of the Byzantine Empire and large parts of the Sassanid Empire were Christianized. After the Sassanid-Byzantine War, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and later Persia itself fell into Arab hands. The new Arab rulers were anti-Trinitarian Christians, and by the 9th century, the anti-Trinitarian Christianity had evolved into a new religion called Islam. And with that, we are at the end for today. Next time, we will be looking at the Christian context of this Syrian anti-Trinitarian pre-Nicene Christianity that we've talked so much about. So until then, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.